Hi, everyone. This is Max. I'm in Berlin, Germany, convening today the first meeting of the European Time Zone Zoom Meetup. We're going to do a close reading together of an Emily Dickinson poem, which is frequently referred to as "This is my letter to the world," based on the first line. I'm going to go ahead and read the poem, and then we'll start with our collaborative close reading. Here goes. This is my letter to the world. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me, the simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen judge tenderly of me. Great. So where to begin? This is a characteristically complicated Emily Dickinson poem, I want to say. I guess we could go through and start maybe gathering some impressions of some of the words. I always find that what's convenient in Emily Dickinson is that she capitalizes the words that are supposed to be important for us. So here we have our first capitalized word is world. So this is my letter to the world. World. What is she saying here? What is the world? How are we meant to understand this capitalized world?
Mac, are you going to call on us, or are we to mute, or what would you like us to do?
That's a good question.
I have an idea, because a question. Did Emily Dickinson study some in German? Because in German, since the nouns are capitalized, maybe that drifted into her mindset.
That's true. The nouns are capitalized in German. And I think that nouns are also capitalized in older forms of English or older print forms of English.
Like Benjamin Franklin, for example.
Right, exactly, yeah. So I think that's a sort of old-fashioned thing that is, I don't really know enough about print culture to say whether by Emily Dickinson's time that would have been kind of anachronistic. But it doesn't seem too too strange. Although what is interesting is that only certain nouns are capitalized. For example, letter is not capitalized in this line. So and as for your question about calling on people, I wasn't going to call on people. If you want to mute and then unmute, that might be okay for the sound. So far, we're okay. There isn't too much ambient noise. So we'll just be mindful when we chime in, and I'll do my best to facilitate the discussion.
And as to the capitalization, the poem that you had us read for Ruth Wise, she did a revolution against capitalization. Everything she did,
right,
was in small caps. So
even her name is
the name, right?
Small caps. Yeah.
So that's just something else to think about with the capitalization.
That might be, so Stanley's making reference to the Ruth Weiss poem that I had, which is called simply Poem, right?
Yeah, the animals have come down from the hills, Yeah, but that was all. She wrote everything in small letters.
That's
right.
what I would say to the Emily Dickinson poem about the capitalization, is that I think that world, I think this is kind of a juxtaposition between world and nature in this poem. To me, she kind of puts them opposite of each other, because to her, I think in this poem, at least how I read it, is that the world represents human society and nature is on the other side, kind of more this godly presence. And I think that this capitalization of world just emphasizes it, and kind of shows us that this is maybe not the whole world, but mostly human society.
That's so you're understanding world in this sense of worldly, or there's this older sense of worldly meaning the world of human affairs or something. That's, I think it's, you find that maybe in the Bible. Maybe somebody who knows better about this can correct me. Right. Okay. Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah. Because there is this opposition that's set up with nature, at least in this first sentence. So Emily Dickinson is writing a poem to the world, the human world, something like civilization or society, maybe, that is being opposed to nature. Okay, good.
I would say the word is everything. It's her readership, the readers, my letter to my readers, to the world, having a biographical approach. Emily Dickinson lived withdrawn. She lived on her own with a family, but absent from the world. So this is the outside world, not her closet, not her room where she was writing. And of course, it is also the world in contrast to nature. Then towards the end, who judges her? Is that God? So something. Another power comes in. So we have the speaker, we have the word, we have nature, and the judge, God.
So there's a lot of,
There's also countrymen, I would say. I don't know if we're only looking at capitalized things, but
Countrymen.
we're not, no, we don't have to look at just capitalized things. It can be free. You're right. Yeah, there's countrymen as well. So there's this idea of the nation. And I think to seize on what you said a second ago, Mark, about the world being her readers or her hypothetical readers, or let's say some kind of literary establishment. This is her letter to that world. Following Unia's gloss of like the world of people, the world of affairs, that never wrote to her, right? So this is there's something that's kind of sad or forlorn or tragic, maybe at the beginning. I think that gets sort of changed around, but so she's writing this letter to people who have never written to her. The simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Okay, so that next couplet I think starts to get really complicated. If anybody wants to try to parse out what the simple news that nature told with tender majesty is supposed to mean here.
See, the idea of her message, a typical modal preposition, a preposition pronoun, and her message, the message of the letter. But the message of the letter, which is given out to hands, will never receive it, that she'll never see. But also her message, her letter's message, seems a reflection of nature, of what nature told. She sides with nature because the world doesn't side with her.
Sure. And she's here to bring the simple news, and there's something about the news, the good news that's very that's very gospel-like, right? Like you're bringing the news that nature told. So she's writing, her letter is nature's news. Or she's siding with nature, as you said. And with tender majesty, this is modifying the news or the way that nature told the news, correct?
That is what I think, yeah.
Your majesty.
Because when she says, for love of her, the nature within the letter. So parallel to loving nature, you should judge tenderly of me, because tender comes with tender majesty, and judge tenderly of me. Tenderly is repeated.
Right at the end, yeah.
So she wants, I think, you judge my letter with its content of nature, let's say, and for love of her, nature, judge tenderly of me, Emily Dickinson.
Yes, I agree. I think that she to me, she's basically saying, just don't shoot the messenger. Like it's not my opinion. I'm just giving this message. To me, she basically translates what nature told her, maybe because she can see it or she can hear it, and she translates what she took in with her senses into words. And I think that's very interesting that she basically says that all her poems, maybe not all her poems, but a few of her poems are not what she thinks, but what nature gave to her, that she's just the messenger, that a poet is a messenger. I think that's a very interesting image.
Super. Right.
I guess sort of building on that, I would see the world that she's talking about as maybe something beyond, maybe not the world of people, but like an otherworldly sort of place. So she's getting these hints from nature, from this other world, like nature's sort of a go-between, like leaving these hints and clues. And so she's never actually gotten solid proof, I guess, of this world, and it's never written to her. But nature is committed to that world and its hands that she also cannot see. So she's saying, you know, I'm trying to write of this and pass on that news, which is maybe why I'm strange, or why I feel like I'm being judged because I'm getting this special message.
Yeah, I always have, I like to read, it's not I tend to read things at word value. I'm very far still from metaphors and what they mean afterwards. So I try first to see what its meaning and actually what the words say. And it comes to mind, and it could be completely wrong, but when she says the simple news that nature told with tender majesty, this is the world. It's the natural world. It's trees and grass and everything, very easily done. However you want to look, whoever made it, it got made. She calls it nature. Some people can call it God, but nature exists, and it was done, and nobody questions it. And it was, we don't know who made it, hands that I cannot see, but everybody has accepted it. It's there. Our world is here. And since we accept all of that nature, then somehow, please accept me, or when you think of me, quote unquote, judge me as easily as you go outside and, let's say, take for granted all the nature that we do take for granted. That's a thought I had, because I read the words, and that what I took out of them.
Good.
Oh, was somebody about to chime in? No.
Yeah, the last thing I thought of her letter going to Bartleby, from Melville's Bartleby. I prefer not to. He worked in a dead letter office. I wonder if her letter went to the dead letter office.
Bartleby, her contemporary.
Yeah.
This is I think there's an interesting opposition here that we've begun to tease out, and that the past few comments have sort of teased out a little bit further between the natural world and the world as she's invoking it here in that very first line. And I think you're right, Unia, to say that she's presenting herself as this kind of, as this messenger, like, don't blame me. I'm just doing the natural thing. Like, and the way that nature is invoked here almost suggests this, like, she can't help herself, right? This is something that she has to do, and it sets her apart a little bit, I think, as you were suggesting, Willow, that it sort of marks her in a way as being like a little bit different, a little bit apart. And there's this kind of like almost, the reading it now together, there's this almost like hippie flower child vibe to the beginning here, where she's like, hey, I'm just with nature. Like, don't blame me. I'm just I'm just telling you how
Yes.
great it all is out there in the world, um,
And she was 100 years before Woodstock.
Yeah.
more than, or yeah,
Yeah.
for sure, yeah. There is this kind of like almost like romantic, since she's 100 years before Woodstock, but she's contemporary with, or shortly after the British Romantic movement. So there is this kind of like this sublime, the nature is figured as sublime. There's this very open, receptive attitude towards nature and the natural world, especially in contrast with industrialization, with like the industrial cities that are sort of cropping up everywhere in the 19th century, or the rapid process of industrialization. So she's relaying the message of nature, and that message is committed to hands I cannot see. And I think, Jackie, you started to say how this is a kind of creation story, that there's something about nature that we just sort of accept because it's already there, it pre-exists us, and it seems to be made by invisible hands, right? Some sort of deity or some kind of universal power. I think that Emily Dickinson, her poems can be quite religious sometimes, and I think she's very much invoking a Christian and specifically Protestant God whenever she's talking about the divine. But she's usually pretty good about like not being too on the nose about it. But I think these invisible hands are definitely the hands of a Christian.
Her message,
God.
it's a woman, her message is committed.
Nature's message.
Yeah, so Mother Nature.
Natura.
Right. Nature is feminine, which is actually very interesting. Maybe something for us to think. I mean, nature has long been feminized. It's not like she's doing, Mother Nature is a figure, right? It's not like Emily Dickinson is doing something completely crazy radical. But I think there is something about the her message here kind of appearing in the middle of the poem, which is very interesting. I don't know if anybody wants to like gloss this couplet any further. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see.
I mean, you have to look at it in the context of what is she doing. She's writing a letter, and she's telling us what she wants to tell about, as simple news that nature told her with tender majesty. And then she refers to nature as her, as you just said, and her message is committed to hands I cannot see. But she writes it to her sweet countrymen, and I like to read it too, that if we need to care for nature, we have to do something with our own hands. So we could read it maybe even that she means these could be the hands of the countrymen, that we have to do something, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense to me that she writes this letter, because she does have a message. The message is conveyed, but it's her own message. Otherwise she wouldn't write the poem. So she needs to do something. And she kind of brings it together. Is what is important to her is the love for her. And that's something that if this is how one could read it, it's just one suggestion, that we have to do something with our heart if we want to give back to nature, would like to serve her. So I would go a little bit beyond of reading it just as a flower girl poem. There's more to it, because there's always more. And also when you look at the word world, this is as big as it can get, Sweet countrymen, that's the people she's dealing with on a daily basis, and who might read that letter, who might read that poem, but world is pretty big. And I also like to read Emily Dickinson in relation, and the own relation she builds up in her poems, and that can stretch quite far sometimes.
Well, last year when the Emily Dickinson Museum invited everyone to send postcards to her in answer to this particular poem, I wrote my postcard from the multiverse, which would take in everything, and anyway. So her Emily Dickinson's world, when she was writing, has expanded to the multiverse. That's what I wrote my answer to her.
That's That's pretty heady, Stanley. And in keeping with some of the headier notes of this poem, which I do think actually gets quite, especially at this point here, starts to get kind of hard to follow. It starts to get rather cerebral. And Suzanne, I take your point about the that it's not just simply like a flower child poem or anything by any stretch, of course. But also your reading of the hands and of the countrymen. And I mean, I'm completely rethinking my gloss from a second ago about this being something divine. And in fact, it seems to be something about like laboring, like actual physical human labor and toil. And the fact that it's ambiguous is part of what makes this a difficult poem, I think, in many ways. I'm very interested all of a sudden, however, in the word committed. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. So I wonder, like, what does committed mean here? Like, what is how is that working? Because I mean, there's many meanings of the word committed, and also archaic ones. Yes.
Could I just add what I think it's a desperate call, as you see in the photograph, for like Van Gogh. You just want somebody to appreciate their work.
Yeah.
The world, and I want to publish, and nobody understands what I want to publish. Nobody understands those sunflowers coming off Van Gogh's canvases. And then all of a sudden, she realizes the hand that cannot see, the people who would receive the letter don't understand what she's doing. She's never going to be published. The magazines don't want it. They don't know where to put her, where to categorize her. Because
I think she wasn't interested in getting published.
Yeah, she wants to.
Really? Thomas Grenfell Higginson, he was one of her editors, and she only allowed a few poems to be published.
But they changed everything. They took away the punctuation. They reduced the capital letters to small letters. They didn't know what to do with it.
And there's several poems where she's where she pulls at this. Listen, there's several of them. Listen to me. Somebody listen to me. We just read one at the beginning, I think, of my poem, where she wants to be heard, and she talks about publishers and what you just said. This whole story of people changing everything. The woman does want to be heard. That's why judge tenderly of me. It's the same kind of a line. Take me seriously. Listen to me, or hear me, or I'm a poet.
I had the same idea of the poem when I read it. Like it sounds really frustrated. The first part, even a bit mad, maybe, like that never worked to me. And then the hands I cannot see, a message committed in the hands I cannot see, judge tenderly of me. It seems to me like the people in the future that will read and will appreciate her work.
Yeah.
Like if you don't appreciate me now, I know this because you never wrote to me, but I will be in the future. And the committed thing, it seems like the message is committed to the better people of the future, something like that.
So if we were to give just a really quick account, or like the most literal account of what we think is being expressed here, so far in these 6 lines of the poem, it would be something along the lines of like, I'm writing a poem, a letter to the world. Nobody really cares about, you know, whatever, but it's not even my poem, it's just nature's poem. I'm just transcribing it. And now I'm committing it, handing it over to hands I cannot see, which means at some point it'll be in the hands of somebody, and I don't know who it is. It's some future hypothetical person, as you're saying, Lee. So that's like a very literal account, I think, right, of what we have here in these first 6 lines. So in that case, a word like committed means like it's just kind of, it's handed to, it's given over to, it's presented to, and so the hands that she cannot see, those are the hands of a hypothetical recipient.
Yes, I agree. But what I would add is that committed has, I think committed has the sense of loyalty that like gets lost when you just translate it with is giving to something, because I think the word committed, it gives the sense of that the person the message is given to cares about it, and it's not just given something that they would like put somewhere in the corner. I don't know, but I think it really is important that she chooses committed here, to show that the hands, that maybe the people that the people that live with her right now may not care about the poem, but maybe people in the future will recognize what a masterpiece this is.
Right, and I think that this extra meaning to committed, to be committed to something means to be dedicated to or loyal to, as you're saying, like to be committed to the cause. And that's when I bring that meaning in, and I don't know if this is almost like retroactive. I'm not sure if committed to had the same meaning necessarily for Emily Dickinson, but for us reading the poem, I mean, it's impossible not to get that layer of being loyal to or dedicated to something. And then especially with the preposition to be committed to something, suddenly makes those two lines read to me as her message is dedicated or loyal to, or in some ways, an intrinsic part of these hands I cannot see. So it becomes something to bring in that meaning starts to change what at least I understand is happening here, the literal account of what's happening, that is of the message being given to these hypothetical hands, and instead the message becomes something about these hands.
It is. I find that committed to, you passing it on, you hand it over, you kind of continue something that is important. So I think there's in this poem something so important to her that she needs to convey, and that's why it becomes a letter to the world. And for me, one of the key phrases that is also very puzzling is that never wrote to me, and you can, and with 2 dashes, by the way, and you can read it in so many different ways. It never wrote to me, but it might write to me in some ways. You can kind of look into the future. That never wrote to me, as you said it, Mary, it's something, she's anguishing about it, that she's in by herself, and there's probably more possibilities. And I find there's this halting in the poem, where she stops and where she also allows us to put more into it than she says. So we are kind of faced with that dilemma, as you all, I think Mary also said that she cannot talk to people about it because she doesn't have that audience at that point, but she still writes that poem. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why I find this is a very crucial line for the poem.
Mm-hmm. To me, it is commitment of nature, the dedication of nature to transmit this message. I would say that the poem is quite reminiscent of Robert Emerson and transcendentalism. She becomes a transparent eyeball, as Emerson describes that the poet goes into nature, that he becomes a seer, a sayer, that the poet interprets what is going on. Max, that's what you probably meant when you said it's quite romantic. Wordsworth, he did the same. So she translates nature to us. Nature is created by hands I cannot see. There is a godly figure. God is represented in nature. That's what the transcendentalists meant. Go into nature and find God and come into harmony with nature, and with that also with God. And I think that is what she's saying here. With tender majesty, here we have the sublime and beautiful Edmund Burke speaking. She admires nature as something grand, as something great. And the message, that is the dedication of nature. Nature sends a message. We can find God in nature, and she interprets that for us.
I think that's really interesting because to me, I think I almost saw it as an opposition between nature and God. Because to me, I think in most other Emily Dickinson poems, when she talks about God, it's almost this, I don't know, like this presence that she does not really trust, and where she kind of highlights that he puts suffering on people, that he's the cause for most of the bad things in the world. And I think with nature, it's basically the opposite, that she mostly highlights what nature gives people, and that it's this great presence. And so to me, it's almost this opposition between there's God in which you believe, and then there's nature. And maybe someday you'll recognize that she's the greater presence.
And nature gets a feminine attribute, whereas God is he. That's an important distinction also to make.
Yes, exactly, because I think it's very obvious in that she capitalizes the H in her, and I think that's a direct opposition between the his and the Bible, for example.
Yeah,
where it's capitalized
that's a really good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. And then, in fact, like the sublime or the divine presence in this poem is in fact a female, right? Like there is no like we were talking a little bit about God and creation, and I'm always like prone to see the religious elements in Emily Dickinson, but here, in fact, like God doesn't really show up all the way, right? Nature is what's sort of divine and sublime, to kind of go with what you were saying, Mark, a little bit about the transcendentalists and their attitude towards nature, and the way that they solve, or the way that they approach nature as a poetic subject, or as a spiritual or sort of spiritual experience. Yeah, I pasted in the chat real quick because the other version I sent was, since we were talking a second ago about the publication reception history of Emily Dickinson, the version that I had sent earlier was the one that had been edited with the commas and the normalized punctuation and everything. But the original version, which is in the forums and which I just pasted in the chat, is the one with the that retains the characteristic Emily Dickinson dashes, which I think are extremely important when it comes to reading the very last lines of the poem. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. Because in the sort of, say, the normalized version with the commas, it's very clear that it's an address to the sweet countrymen at the end. For love of her, comma, sweet, for my love of, judge tenderly of me, sweet countrymen, for my love of nature and her message, right? But with the dashes, it gets like far more complicated, especially with the dash between sweet and countrymen, or the way that the dashes bring out sweet, which is also capitalized. And I don't know, what do we make of the highlighting of sweet here towards the end of the poem? The way that she's really calling our attention to the word sweet, the adjective, this sort of way that she's endearing the countrymen to her. It's such an unusual word to call attention to, also, especially in this poem, I think.
I keep looking at this last line, and if you read the first line and the last line, I think that's what she wants. World, judge tenderly of me, and when you call somebody sweet, capitalized, you are maybe she wants to win them over, so somewhere along the line people will judge tenderly of me, because I keep looking at the first and the last line, and that's what I'm hearing of world. I'm writing to you, and when you hear what I have to say, please be kind to me, be kind to me, the poet of 1,000 poems, be kind to me. Sweet people.
That's a plea, isn't it? A plea to.
Oh yeah.
Judge.
Yeah, it's a plea.
Oh yeah, and that's maybe where the sweet comes in. Make the plea sweeter, maybe.
That's Shakespeare.
I don't.
The word judge is something that to judge. Why does she want to be judged? Another question that I have. I mean, why is that word there?
Isn't it Shakespearean? Shakespeare's comedies, they always close with please judge this play tenderly, or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
If you like the play, where's your applause?
And it's
clap your hands.
which is feels different in the context of a play, because play, especially Shakespeare plays like 5 hours long or something. And so when you get to the end, it's kind of like okay, it was all right. If you liked it, please leave a positive review. Whereas here in this very short poem, it has a very different effect.
But I mean, the lines before, the countryman, we enter the realm of the pastoral, which is also quite Shakespearean.
Mm.
To get back to the capitalization of sweet, for love of her sweet countrymen. The countrymen are those that live in harmony with nature, and also that brings us back to transcendentalism. Live in harmony with nature, come into a communion with nature, and I think this is what's expressed by sweet and the capitalization.
So you're understanding countrymen in a narrower way.
Farmers, people living in the countryside, living in nature, and people who are not city dwellers.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting, because I understand countrymen as my fellow Americans, meaning like to you, sweet country, like all of you, the entire world that I'm writing this letter to. But it's interesting actually to really pause on that, countrymen, and think about country, not just as like the nation, but country as like where as nature, as the natural world. So then that this finally here further complicates at least our initial reading of the poem being or opposing the world and nature, right? Because like, where do these countrymen belong? Who is she ultimately addressing? Is she addressing the world that is she addressing the world that is in opposition to nature, or is she addressing some part of nature or some part of the world that's more natural? So my closing question here is, who is she ultimately addressing? Mark, you started to say that she's addressing perhaps people like her, or other. You said the people of the country or something. I guess I'm wondering whether the opposition remains here at the end of the poem, whether she's the agent of nature addressing the sort of unnatural world, or if something starts to collapse here and she's actually addressing like-minded people or allies.
Are you referring to my interpretation of world?
No. The actually Unia's interpretation from world that kicked off the conversation half an hour ago, just of like the worldly world, the world of people, the world of men, versus the natural world, civilization versus nature, or something like that.
I think because she's talking about nature having told her some news, so there's a sense that nature has addressed her, and I would guess that if we understand that, then she probably also has some relationship to countrymen and the people of the actual, like, literal world. So I would say that she's addressing something else that she hasn't had contact with.
So the countrymen are then these hypothetical readers in their invisible hands.
Yeah, I guess that's still an open question, because they're in
No,
there.
it's I think this is what makes this poem very difficult, is it gets hard at the end to figure out who exactly she's addressing. I find I think that it's sort of shifting a little bit, and I'm having trouble figuring out where she's positioning herself in relation to the world and to us, the readers, and where and what community she imagines herself to be in here at the end. The poem.
And actually,
oh yeah, go ahead, Stanley.
Actually, I think she's out, like we mentioned before, a plea. She would like to have an answer. she would like to have someone respond. And when we just spent so much time on sweet, it seems like it might have even been a little bit sarcastic.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I totally get the sarcasm. That's I always want
Oh,
to.
God.
Oh, sorry, Jackie, what'd you say?
For love of her. This-
Right.
Yeah.
There's I mean, I always want to go. I want to do the full like, oh, this is Emily Dickinson's like almost like cocky like poem, right? Which is like, you know, I'm the servant of nature. I just do what I'm told. I do what I feel like doing. And all of you don't get it, and you're never gonna get it. And that's why you've never written me back. That's but I don't know that that's entirely what, what the poem is doing. The poem might have a slightly like softer, sweeter edge ultimately. but I do read sweet as sarcastic, like, and thus this sort of almost Shakespearean plea there at the end to leave a good review as sarcastic, like of being,
Everybody applaud.
Exactly.
I was saying, you know, judge
Do to me as
me.
I've done to you. Do to me as I have done to you. I was quite polite to you. I said
I sent you little letters.
readers, and now judge me tenderly.
Right. That's there's almost like, you know, if we can go the full meta route here and you know, bring in some context from the other Emily Dickinson poems. There's almost this show of or demonstration of skill or mastery to be writing a letter to people who can't write them back. Right? There's this, you know, we understand the world never wrote to her. In some ways that can be kind of like tragic and forlorn. She's sort of like an isolated figure that's kind of like biographical reading. But then there's also the, you know, the more Modpovian meta reading, which is like, like I write the poem to you, to all of you who don't, you know, who may or may not read them. I don't care. You don't write poems anyway, so what does it matter? I'm the one who's I'm the one who's transcended. I'm the one who's in touch with nature. I'm the invisible eyeball who's transmitting some truth about the world. And you don't get it. You may read it, you may not. It doesn't matter to me whether you do or not.
But it's also in the simple news that nature told. Like it sounds kind of condescending to me. Like it's simple, so.
Right, of course, right, and right. It's simple. It's simple for her because she's the, as Mark said, the transparent eyeball, the invisible eyeball of Emerson. She's become this conduit for truth. In the way that, you know, her countrymen might not be.
Yes, what I would say is that maybe to me, she basically talks about different levels of maybe connection with nature. Maybe there's the world as the society who's not connected at all with nature. And then there are the countrymen who are maybe a little bit more connected. I mean, we won't confuse the speaker with Emily Dickinson herself, but she, I think she lived in the country, I think. So maybe that's an aspect as well. And maybe that other people who might get a little bit more easily than maybe the people who live in the city. But she herself is the one that is connected with nature. Maybe not she alone as an individual, but maybe poets are the ones who are connected with nature. Maybe that's how she meant it. But I think I think it's really interesting because she has this desire for connection in this poem, when in reality writing a poem is very isolating. I think that's very interesting.
Right, and the connection is as we've or the possibility for connection in writing a poem as we've explored elsewhere in Mappo, especially with the early poems, is something, is this almost like unrequited writer-reader relationship. That's
Completely.
for some of the poets that we read, it's like an automatically requited thing. Like the Sid Corman poem that we read, it's like you can't. It's almost like you can't escape that. It's like you know, when you read that poem, it's like, oh, okay, you got it. Like, I guess, you know, we've connected now or whatever. But when you read Emily Dickinson, sometimes you're like, oh no, like did we you know, am I actually your public? Am I actually your audience? Is this something you care about? Is this something that the poem cares about? So it's a kind of different dynamic.